All right. So here's what's going to happen now. YouNoodle allocates 25 mil a year. They take that money from 55 different countries, let's say like Chile, for instance, and they help companies go abroad. That's what they do. But the question today is what they're going to discuss. What Torsten is going to tell you about is essentially, is it worth it? So if a company in Latvia wants to go abroad, let's say to Chile, for instance, should they do it? And specifically, what YouNoodle can do to help us out. So, ladies and gentlemen, warm hand of applause for Torsten, please. Please.
All right, guys. It's a hard act to follow. It was an amazing panel right before. I am not going to talk about crypto. Actually, should I be up here? Should I maybe be down here? Is this easier? Yeah, I guess. Let's do that. I'm not going to talk about crypto, but I am going to talk about another asset that moves across borders, and it is all of us, entrepreneurs, startups, founders. The world is changing, and it's so much easier to go to cool places. But it's not always worth it. You know, it can be a massive distraction. We're going to go through some of the ways that you can do it, pros and cons, some of the programs I've been involved in. So those of you that are interested in leaving where you are now and possibly going somewhere else, stay. If you are not interested in that topic, there's an excellent coffee shop up on the second floor that has free cappuccinos. They're great, but we're only going to talk about startups moving across borders and why that's sometimes good and sometimes bad. Cool? Awesome. Welcome, guys. So, first of all, the reason why I care about this subject is that I am very much the subject myself. So, born and raised in Copenhagen, Denmark. I have lived in Chile. I've lived in the UK. I currently live in San Francisco, where I've been the past 8 years. And I have worked in various capacities with every single one of those programs that you see up there. So if you are ever considering moving, I can definitely tell you about some of the different things that are out there. So that's very much the background here. I'm also an investor in 2 different small venture funds. I don't invest myself directly in startups. And I'm involved as an advisor capacity in different ways. So I try to get myself as much into the weeds of the global startup world as at all possible. So let's start looking at, hang on. There we go. Why? So I mentioned that the world is changing, and it's like we've heard it at all the other stages, that all these fantastic things are happening, all the technology changes, and all these tools that we have at our disposal. But it's relevant to this problem in one very important way, and that is 10 years ago, if you wanted to scale a global technology company, you almost had to be in Silicon Valley. It was the only way that you could get enough money, enough expertise, and talent and resources to grow your companies. It's only 10 years ago. And today, I think most of us will agree that that's not at all necessary. There are plenty of companies that are scaling from all sorts of different places, and I think that's really good. It's a democratization of access to technology that's really, really good for us. What it also means is that there's a lot of startups that don't really associate with a given city or country. You know, you just start off and you figure, okay, well, I kind of lived in Denmark, and then I lived a little bit in South America, and then I was over here, and my co-founder, you know, just YouNoodle's case, by the way. So my co-founder is Korean-Argentinian. Okay, she was born in Korea. She moved to Argentina when she was 5 with her family. She's culturally Argentinian. I met her at a conference in Norway, and we started the company in San Francisco, California. I mean, just... And that's not a weird example. It's actually really common today that people do this. You see a lot of virtual organizations, and there's all these different permutations. That's why this matters. So I think the tools that we have at our disposal are really, really powerful, but they don't always apply. So I want to go through some of the pros and cons here. First of all, looking at my own case, when I moved abroad, I think one of the most important things that I learned as a young, green, Danish engineer, startup entrepreneur, you know, not really even, was that I got a perspective. I talked to a lot of different people from a lot of different cultures, and that had an impact on how I saw myself as an entrepreneur and how I saw the company I was building and the perspective and the potential of that company. And I can't put a price on that. It's just incredibly important. I can't even imagine if I had been stuck in Copenhagen during all this time and I had never left. So that's probably the number one thing you get out of that. But I think a close second is the network of people. Because, of course, I'm in San Francisco at the moment, and you know, I am a strong believer in the fact that Silicon Valley is a mindset. At least Silicon Valley of the future is a mindset. And it's about learning that mindset and building whatever you can in whatever place you are. And I certainly think the people you have around you in that mindset are helping each other. I think that's a fundamental thing here about the global startup ecosystem. It's a bunch of really helpful people. Generally, people want to help. If you move to some other country, they will help you, and they will try to do their best to make sure you succeed. And I think that's a close second of a really, really valuable thing about moving. There's also other things that matter. You get access to resources. A number of the programs that I'm going to show you in a moment actually give you money. Or maybe they give you tax incentives, or maybe they give you other things that help you scale in a market that you may not have. There are also some types of businesses that are just better in some markets, right? If you take the American market, there's about 300 million people. They all have the same, currency, a lot of a similar culture, same legislation, regulation. Although we're getting better and better in Europe, we're still a long way away from how relatively easy it is to scale in the US. But not every product is for the American market. So maybe you're better for the Indian market or for South America or anywhere else. So there's a lot of good reasons for this, right? Of course, there are also some, pitfalls. And I think, imagine if there was no pitfalls, we would all just go. Now, why wouldn't we go? It sounds like there's nothing but good things here. Some of the most common reasons for failure when people move are, first of all, a massive distraction. So let's say you're building a company, you're really excited about it, you feel like you have at least a prototype, an attractive market opportunity, you have your co-founders, you may have your founding team, and then you move somewhere else. You get pulled out of that network you were just in. You're pulled out of the co-working space you're in. You're pulled out of all of your social support, and maybe you go somewhere that needs a lot of work. Maybe you need to set up all sorts of stuff, and I'll come back to that as well. That's probably the number one problem, is it's just a distraction. So if you don't do it right, it can actually be really bad for your business. I think there was a number of other things. For instance, maybe you're not a fit to that culture, right? So I was in Chile for a year. Maybe if you go to Chile and you don't like the Chileans, maybe that's something that makes you as a founder unhappy. And there's so much ups and downs in the founder journey anyway that we don't need unnecessary unhappiness. So there are definitely also some pitfalls, and it is something that can be difficult in the growth of a company. But I think the most important thing about when you weigh the risks here is it's not a permanent thing. You can go somewhere and come back half a year later and say, okay, great, we tried that. You don't have to go and incorporate your company right away when you go somewhere else. So definitely it's something that no one should see as permanent. That's probably the single best advice on this count. So let's look a little bit about some of all the different things to think about in that consideration. Just let me see a show of hands. Who here are currently running their business somewhere else than where they grew up? There's like maybe 3-4 people or so. Who here are thinking about growing their business somewhere else from where they grew up? There's another couple of people. So for those of you that are either currently doing it or thinking about it, some of the things that I would recommend you think about are, first of all, the very basic, almost legalities of doing this, right? Do you need a visa? Do you need, some of these programs actually help you with your visa, and maybe some of the countries you don't need a visa for, right? If you go elsewhere in Europe, you're fine. But also, do you need to incorporate? And if so, if you have to incorporate your company somewhere, is that complicated? That can vary dramatically from country to country, how that whole process is. And that leads you into taxation and all sorts of other stuff. But there are also some other things that are important. I mean, the choice of city is also really important. And I generally like seeing it as a choice of city more than a choice of country. Because when you think of startup ecosystems, and there's been a lot of research into this, both by the Kauffman Foundation, and for those of you that read Brad Feld from Techstars' book, it's really all about density. it's not really about how many entrepreneurs you have in, let's say, a country, but it's about how close they are to one another and how closely knit those networks are. And that's why the choice here is really much more one of city than it's one of country. And what do you look for? Well, sometimes it's market-driven. Sometimes you just know that the company you're about to set up, that market is perfect for the US healthcare market. So you're like, great, I'm going to look at US cities for this. Where do I go? So very often do we see it's market-driven, but it doesn't always have to be. Sometimes it's because there is a program that's really, really cool, and you actually want that experience, and you're willing to give it a shot, and you don't really know, but you try. And that leads me to some of the ones, accelerator and program. So those are actually two different things in my world. An accelerator is a program specifically that gets you sort of an investment and mentoring and other resources to make you grow. Right? It's like Y Combinator, Fire and Startups, Techstars. There are also national accelerators that are run by governments, and I'll give you some examples. A program is more of a program that's designed to help you with the practicalities of moving. So, for instance, if you were to go to, if you are not from the EU and you want to go to Denmark, there's something called Start-Up Denmark. It's not an accelerator. They don't give you any money. There's no co-working space. But what they do is they help you with the practicalities, right? You would need a work visa. If you're not European, you're going to need a work visa. And you're going to need various other things. So that's kind of the difference between program and accelerator. And to be clear, accelerator is not always a good thing. Maybe you're not at a stage where that's useful. Maybe they offer you a terrible deal in terms of your equity investment. So it's just a matter of you need to think about the combination of a move and program, and is it an accelerator or not, and all these other things. So it's complicated. And I think the single best advice here is that it's not permanent, which is good. You can actually decide, okay, hey, this didn't work out. I'm going to try something else. There are some personal reasons as well, of course, for all of us to figure out what's right. Founding team, do you go? Does the founding team go? Does the whole company go? I mean, those are all very important things that could also lead to a distraction. So I think actually we can, no, let me wait with questions until the end, because I think we'll pass the mic around. So I'm just going to go through a couple of different example programs here so that you have an idea of what's out there and how this stuff actually works. Start-Up Chile was mentioned earlier, and I think it's probably the single most successful example of what I would call a national accelerator. So an accelerator program that's run by a government that gives you money and that gives you all sorts of other good stuff in the process. Start-Up Chile started about 6 years ago, and they are currently in their 20th generation. It is a massive program. They take, every year, they get about 5,000 applicants, and they take about 300 of them and invite them to Chile and give each of them roughly $40,000. Depends a little bit on the exchange rate. So it's a massively popular program. It's harder to get into Start-Up Chile in percentages than it is to get into undergraduate at Stanford. So it's extremely popular. A lot of people go, but a lot of people also don't stay. And I think that's an important thing. You're not moving to Chile here forever. They actually see only about 20% or so of the founders that go staying in Chile. But for them, that's really good. That means 20% actually are staying and building companies in Chile. And what they say about the other 80% is, well, you go and you interact with everyone else, and you build networks, and you develop your products, and sometimes you hire people, sometimes you set up stuff, sometimes you come back, and they're really totally fine with that. And Stanford actually studied this program and came to the conclusion that it had already in the 6 years a massive impact on the local Chilean ecosystem of local entrepreneurs, because they're exposed to all these foreigners. Imagine this, we're talking about 300 startups a year, not just 300 founders, being imported to Santiago in Chile. That is a substantial number. So French Tech Ticket, I wanted to mention that because it's actually mostly a copy of Start-Up Chile, but they are one of the European countries that do the same thing. They help, if you're European, you get access to, I think it's 45,000 euros. I don't remember, but it's in the same range. You don't have to just be in Paris. You can go anywhere in France. They give you a lot of other resources, mentoring and co-working space. And if you are not European, they help you with the visa side as well. And I think that's a core part of what you need to do as such a program to do well. And as I'm sure you've all seen of how much good stuff is happening, particularly in Paris these days with the new Station F. I actually had my kind of opening picture is from the opening of Station F in Paris, which is a massive startup space in an old station, railway station building in Paris. And this is Emmanuel Macron, the new president, who's opening. And you know, Facebook moved in, and a number of other big companies moved in, and a lot of startups. And it's really cool to see the use of old massive spaces to be used for this. So definitely a good place to go. The last program I want to mention is something that's called Parallel 18. Parallel 18. It is the island of Puerto Rico. So technically a part of the US, but culturally a very separate entity. Puerto Rico was hit by Hurricane Maria, I think 3 months ago, 4 months ago. It's been a little while. And suffered massive devastation. I mean, there's still, I think, well over 1 million households without power and running water. And it's a small island that is traditionally being very tourism-driven and agricultural and basic services. And the government there decided, why don't we attract startups to this island? Because they have some really relevant tax benefits. It's different, the tax treatment is different in Puerto Rico than in the rest of the US, which is interesting. But it's still technically the US, so you still need an American visa to go. So these guys here are essentially helping both with money, and I think it's similar, about $40,000 that they give you, and they set up, they help you set up the structure so that you can be in the US but still get the preferential tax treatment. And their goal, of course, is to create tomorrow's economy in an island and a culture that really needs it. So, so I've been there a number of times, and it's really fantastic work that they're doing there. So I wanted to at least give you some ideas of what these options are. And before I would love to hear some questions from some of you that are thinking about this. Pick my brain as much as you possibly can. But I want to make one more point here that I think is really, really important. And it is, there is a traditional view of this whole, oh, let's all go somewhere and build our startups as it's a brain drain, right? You know, let's all go to San Francisco, or let's all go somewhere else, or let's move to London, and you know, overall, each city or country are losing out because this happens. And I'm a very strong believer in the fact that that there is an effect the other way as well. So first of all, a lot of people come home. You know, you go somewhere, you learn, you build a network, and you come back and you say, okay, with all this stuff that I now have, all these connections and all these resources, I'm going to do something good at home. And what you can do at home, all of a sudden you come back and you have a completely different mindset. So your relative opportunity compared to other startup founders in your hometown is just substantially different. And I actually see it a lot from San Francisco, a lot of European founders that go to San Francisco for half a year, for a year, or for a while, do something, start something, build something, scale something, and even if they're not founders, they'll go with one of the successful European companies, startups that have expanded, and they come over, and then they come back home, and they start doing stuff. They start building companies that have the mindset of wherever they went. I think this whole exchange of entrepreneurial spirits and ideas is incredibly important in making sure that we create new, cool things at home. And it comes back to this original point that we don't need Silicon Valley anymore. All of this stuff can happen each in our own cities and in our own countries. But what we do need is to make sure we all learn from one another. And there's nothing better than a global mindset. Whatever it is that you do, it's extremely helpful in getting over some of the very difficult parts of scaling startups. So I see it just as much as brain gain as brain drain. And I think that's just a point that I wanted to make. I think with that, I would love to just open up for some questions, and whether they are individual to say I have a startup I want to move to, whatever, that's totally fine. But they can also be general, as in how does it work? How do you solve stuff? Any takers?
Ladies and gentlemen, please.
Yes. One here. I think you get a mic in just a moment.
Oh.
You have to catch it, though.
Go.
Hi. We have green startup. We are two employees and 16 volunteers.
Okay, cool.
Very experienced engineers, and next Tuesday we are building house in 24 hours.
Okay, cool.
And we are building it from waste materials, like a big construction company waste. And which is destination where to go with these ideas and to develop. We see that.
So are you asking where should I go with this startup,
Yeah.
given what you're doing? I think that sounds great. And also, good job motivating a lot of volunteers to be a part of the project. That's for a founder, a really important skill, I think, to be able to do. So awesome. I think in that case, there are probably two different drivers I would look at. One would be the market for these houses. And again, I'm not an expert in this field, but figure out what are the kinds of people that would buy these houses, and where is that market, not necessarily the biggest, but where is that market the easiest for you to get in and scale in. And that's kind of one driver that may lead you one place. But I think there's another driver, which is there is a lot of government initiatives and foundations that are supporting various types of sustainability. And you might find a city that particularly has a program that's aimed at this, saying, hey, maybe we don't have the most amazing market, but we actually can support companies like yours with either money or something else that may be really useful. I think those two are the main drivers. I don't have offhand like the perfect program for you, but at least like with that, you should be able to figure out. And by the way, on YouNoodle.com, I list a bunch of these programs. So you can and see more about them if you're interested. You can also Google Startup Visa. That'll give you a wiki page that has a long list of countries with different programs where they're assisting startups that are moving abroad. I think that's probably the best I could do on that one for now. Any other questions? There are a couple more. I don't know who will first.
Please, please.
And just let me know when we're out of time. I think we have a bit more.
It's good, it's good, it's good.
Awesome.
Go. Is it on?
Yes. No.
No. Okay.
Great.
Good.
I can hear you.
Might not be a question, but something to pick your brain with. You know,
Okay.
you encourage
Let's
people
take
to
the
come
questions.
home. That's
Yeah.
great. Just speaking from my personal experience, when you just pass a lot of times outside, you know, like some years, and all of a sudden you develop a new mindset, which is great. You have, you know, this great entrepreneurial, you know, skills and friends and network, and then you come back.
So
You
far the
might
most
find
popular.
out
I know that
it's-
problem. That is
it's
it.
hard to, you know, fit in anymore, and the home is not functioning the way
Yep.
things are functioning in San Francisco, and things. I mean, just want to
So,
to comment on that.
Yes, I can definitely comment on that. So, since I turned 18, I have lived about 70–80% of my life abroad. So I have that problem. Imagining coming back to Copenhagen right now, while it would be nice to get back to my family, it also is with a risk of being something very provincial. As in like, hey, I live in San Francisco and I live a lot of other places, now I'm in Copenhagen, what is this place, right? And I know a lot of others that have that problem. And I think the way that I look at it myself, I could absolutely imagine coming back. At the very least, I would say coming back to Europe. I don't know if it's Denmark or not Denmark, but there's you know, you've seen the monkey president that the US has at the moment. I totally don't associate myself, and I could absolutely see me coming back. So some of the considerations I think are, first of all, just like it's not permanent to move out, I don't see it as permanent to move back. So I don't think it's the end of the world if I were to try to go to Denmark and maybe after 6 months it's terrible and I do something. So that's the first thing that like makes me much less scared. I think it's a different generation where it's okay to not see yourself necessarily as living in one place for all your lives. But I think it's also, you know, the reason why I'm okay living abroad and really haven't, missed my family that much is that I kind of promise myself to regularly travel, and I set aside a budget to regularly travel and see friends and family.
Torsten, on this note, maybe we take another question to
Okay.
keep things going. Please.
I can elaborate afterwards.
Yes, excellent
But there's a
idea.
lot of stuff you can do to make that process be, you know, much more doable.
Hello.
Let's
So I have a question. What do you think is the most supportive and friendliest place for a startup? like in country?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, for those of you that are here for the crypto panel, right? There is a huge difference between both cities and countries and how friendly they are to, and that's just one example, right? I think it's extremely dependent on where you are. But generally, some of the things I would look at is I would look at the ease of doing business. That's really an important one, right? If you have massive bureaucracy every time you do something, it's just a derailment for a startup. I would look at access to talent. I think that's also a really important part. I wouldn't worry too much about things like, are the taxes really high? Because you know what? For most of your startup's life, you're not going to be making a profit. So it doesn't really matter. I mean, at the end of the day, as long as you can run a company and you have some income and you have some expenses, it's very similar in most countries. So I would not care too much about things like taxes. I would look at the cost of doing business, the ease of doing business, and access to talent, probably.
Torsten, one question on my end. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to sacrifice. Lady, please. Please.
Hi. I had a question about your experience in Chile. What were you doing there? Were you in the accelerator?
I'm not sure if that was on. She's asking about my experience in Chile. I was actually not part of Start-Up Chile because it didn't exist at the time. I went there with my Danish engineering university. So I went there to study abroad, and I was there for almost a year. I was in Valparaiso, and that was mostly the cultural and experience context. All of the startup side has been through work with Start-Up Chile and a number of others. I go to Chile about once a year, and I feel very well up to date with how that program is. I know a lot of the startups going through, but I've actually never been through that myself.
Okay, thanks.
Start with the slides. Right.
Ladies, do you want your last one, or are we done?
This is the last one. I'm not going to ask, maybe in private, something about San Francisco and access to capital. But
Awesome.
Torsten, thank you very
Thanks so
much.
much.
Hand of applause for
Appreciate
this man, please.